filed more briefs than any other organization in challenging the individual mandate and other provisions of this law. Today, the Supreme Court handed the Obama administration a victory in the battle, but the administration lost the larger war that it has been waging on constitutional principles of limited government. The Supreme Court decision today rules the individual mandate unconstitutional 5-4 under the Commerce Clause. It then goes on to rewrite the statute to shoehorn the individual mandate into the existing laws regarding taxation. That's important because the existing law regarding taxation promises constitutional limits on the federal government's power. The court also went on to strike down crucial parts of the Medicaid expansion provision, which intruded on the constitutional rights of the states under the spending clause of the Constitution. That, so far as I know, is the first decision in American history ever to strike down a law under the spending clause. So although the administration today won the particular case in hand, what they lost was their effort to expand the Commerce Clause to allow the federal government to force people to do practically anything. What the court did was 5-4, ruled the individual mandate exceeds Congress's power to regulate commerce. They also ruled that the Medicaid expansion provisions exceed Congress's spending clause powers. Then they went on to uphold the individual mandate as a kind of tax on not having insurance. That's problematic, and the promised constitutional protections that the court refers to are going to have to be clarified in future litigation. But I, for one, regard today's decision as a major step forward for constitutional protections against unlimited federal authority. It's unfortunate, but it's understandable that California is going to go ahead with that. I wish that California would resist that effort of the federal government to take over health care in this country, but that's the course that they've chosen. In the long run, I think the state exchange, as with the rest of this statute, is going to lead to more and more government controls over health insurance and a deprivation of consumer freedom of choice. The problem with the healthcare market in this country is too much government and too little consumer choice. And what the Obama administration's healthcare takeover represents is a further deprivation of the individual's right to choose what health care they want, how to pay for it, and so forth. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court today upheld that. But again, I think they did so in a manner that respects constitutional boundaries and sets important precedent for restricting future Congresses. The Medicaid provision of the statute forces states to increase Medicaid eligibility and sign up people on their Medicaid rolls that they otherwise would not have. For some states, not only that, but for some states it's even worse. Like Arizona expanded Medicaid eligibility back a few years ago when they were flush with cash, and they'd like to reduce it back to the federal requirement instead of the more generous standard they had provided. And the law requires states to maintain their current eligibility or expand that eligibility, not to reduce it. So that forces Arizona to stick with checks that it wrote back when it still had a lot more money than it now has, and restricts their ability to reduce that. And the problem with the statute was this was backed up by the threat of taking away all of the state's Medicaid funding, which in some states' cases is like 40% of the entire state budget. And what the court has said in the past is the federal government cannot force states to do things. It can pay them money in exchange for doing things, but it can't force them to do things. Well, then the question is, when is the federal government putting so much financial pressure on a state that it's basically force instead of a freedom of choice? And the court has never decided that issue until today. One of the really historic things about this decision today is that for the first time ever, the court says that a law goes too far under the spending clause. The way they remedied that was by saying, what we're going to say is that the government cannot withhold all of the state's Medicaid funding. It can withhold a portion of that for failure to comply. Now, of course, what that's going to do is force more people onto the California's bills. California's going to have to pay for more and more health care for more and more people as a result of this. And that's, an already cash-strapped state is now going to be forced to subsidize people who weren't even on the rolls already. That's very bad for California's economy, and it's very bad for principles of limited government. I think the bottom line of today's decision is that although we lost this particular case, this case sets crucial and fantastic new precedent for restrictions on federal power under the Constitution that we're going to see enforced in future years. Remember, since the New Deal, the Supreme Court has only struck down 3 laws under the Commerce Clause, including today. And today what they did was they drew an important line of principle saying this far and no farther can Congress go. And that's a very important holding that was signed on to by 5 different justices. So that's a very important step today. The next step is going to have to be finding out what those limits on the taxing power are, because the court rescued the individual mandate by saying it's a tax, even though, of course, the administration claimed it was not and Congress claimed it was not. Although I don't blame them, they didn't read the law before they passed it. But in any case, by rescuing it by calling it a tax instead, the Supreme Court says, but there are limits on the taxing power. So the next round is to find out what real strength do those limits on the taxing power have. The decision today says, well, if the taxing power gets too punitive, it'll be regarded as a regulation. Well, where is that line going to be drawn?